You've got 30 minutes. Take what you can carry. The rest stays.
This is my land. I've worked this ground my whole life.
Doesn't look like something you honestly own. You don't fit the profile for a spread like
Got the
this.
deed and paperwork inside. The bank hasn't finished this. We're still fighting it.
Paperwork doesn't impress me. Anybody can wave a stack of papers. Doesn't mean it's really yours.
The air in the Nash County morning was thick, the kind of heavy, humid southern heat that clings to your skin long before the sun has even fully cleared the tree line. For Eddie Milton Wise, this was the smell of home. It was the scent of damp earth, of hog feed, and of a legacy that had been carved out of the North Carolina dirt with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn refusal to break. But on this particular morning, the rhythm of the farm, the low grunt of the livestock, the rustle of the wind through the crops, was shattered by a sound that didn't belong. It was the crunch of gravel under heavy tires, not the familiar rattle of a neighbor's pickup, but the disciplined, aggressive roll of a convoy. Eddie stood on his porch, his hand resting on the railing he'd painted himself. He watched as the dust settled, revealing the white and green markings of the sheriff's department. Then came the others, federal marshals, men in tactical gear, carrying the kind of weight that suggested they weren't there for a conversation. At the head of it all was a deputy whose expression held something far more personal than a legal mandate. It wasn't just an eviction notice in his hand, it was an ultimatum. The deputy looked at the land, then looked at Eddie, and in that look, there was a century of history. A history of people who believed that certain men were never meant to own the ground they stood on. "You've got 30 minutes, the deputy said, his voice devoid of empathy. "Take what you can carry. The rest belongs to the state." Welcome back to the channel. Today we're peeling back the layers of a case that serves as a haunting reminder of the systemic pressures facing black farmers in America. A story of a man who spent his life building a sanctuary, only to have it surrounded by those sworn to protect the law. This isn't just a story about a property dispute. It's a story about a $4.4 million reckoning, a battle for the soul of the American dream, and a deputy who learned the hard way that justice, though sometimes delayed, can be devastating when it finally arrives. Before we dive into the harrowing details of the Wise family stand, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We tell the stories that history tries to bury, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Now, to understand how a decorated veteran and a lifelong farmer ended up facing a small army on his own front porch, we have to go back to the beginning, to the soil itself. Eddie Milton Wise wasn't just a farmer, he was a man of discipline, a retired Army veteran who understood the value of order, hard work, and the chain of command. When he and his wife, Dorothy, moved onto their 106-acre farm in the early 1990s, they weren't just looking for a business, they were looking for a home. They specialized in something rare for the area, high-quality hogs, raised with a level of care that earned them a reputation across the county. For 25 years, the Wise farm was a model of productivity. But in the American South, the success of a black farmer has historically been met with a peculiar kind of friction. The soil may be colorblind, but the institutions that govern the land are not. Since the early 20th century, black land ownership in the United States has plummeted, not because of a lack of skill, but because of a coordinated effort of predatory lending, legal loopholes, and outright intimidation. Eddie knew this history. He lived it every time he walked into a government office to discuss his loans. He felt the shift in the room, the sudden coldness, the missing paperwork that always seemed to plague his files, while his white neighbors moved through the process with ease. The trouble didn't start with a bang, it started with a ledger. Eddie had been part of the landmark Pigford versus Glickman class action lawsuit, a massive legal battle where the USDA admitted to decades of systemic discrimination against black farmers. While the settlement was a moral victory, for many farmers like Eddie, it was a practical nightmare. The promised relief was often too little, too late, or bogged down in so much red tape that it became a secondary form of harassment. By the mid-2010s, the USDA claimed Eddie was behind on his payments. Eddie countered that the government had failed to properly apply the credits from the discrimination settlement, effectively creating a debt trap designed to force him off the land. But while the lawyers argued in distant offices, the reality on the ground in Nash County was becoming increasingly hostile. Local law enforcement began to take a keen interest in the Wise property. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about who had the right to be there. And one deputy in particular seemed determined to be the one to turn the key in the lock. Imagine the scene for a moment. You are 70-some years old. You have served your country. You have spent 3 decades pouring your sweat into the earth. And every time you drive into town, you see the same patrol car. You feel the eyes on you. This deputy, whom we'll refer to as the primary antagonist in this local escalation, didn't just see a farmer in a civil dispute. He saw a target. Witnesses would later describe an atmosphere of targeted harassment, unnecessary stops, lingering presence at the edge of the property, and a tone of voice that suggested the law was a weapon, not a shield. The deputy's rhetoric wasn't just professional, it was poisoned. There were comments made in passing, the kind of off-the-clock remarks that reveal the true character of a man behind a badge. He spoke of the farm as if it were a stain on the county, an anomaly that needed to be corrected. To him, Eddie Wise wasn't a citizen with rights. He was a squatter on land that belonged to someone more deserving. This wasn't just about a mortgage, it was about the fundamental belief that a black man should not own 100 acres of prime North Carolina real estate. Then came the morning of the eviction. It was a cold February day in 2016. Eddie and Dorothy were inside their home, a modest house filled with the mementos of a lifetime. Dorothy was ill at the time, her health failing, which made the sudden arrival of 14 government vehicles all the more traumatic. The deputy arrived not with a social worker or a civil mediator, but with the posture of a conqueror. There was no knock, there was a demand. "Get out, now!" Eddie tried to show them the paperwork, the ongoing appeals, the evidence that the foreclosure was based on discriminatory practices. He was met with cold steel. The deputy didn't want to see the papers. He wanted to see the backs of the Wise family as they walked away from their life's work. In a move that shocked even the surrounding neighbors, the authorities didn't just ask them to leave. They began hauling their belongings onto the lawn. Family photos, Dorothy's medical supplies, the very bed she slept in, all tossed into the damp grass like refuse. Think about that for a moment. You've spent 25 years building a sanctuary. In 30 minutes, it's gone. But it's what the deputy did next that would eventually lead to the massive $4.4 million fallout. As Eddie stood there, watching his life be dismantled, the deputy didn't just maintain the peace. He gloated. He used language that belonged in the 1950s, not the 2010s. He made it clear that this wasn't just an eviction, it was a purification. The Wises were forced into a local motel, stripped of their livelihood, their animals left behind to be handled by the state. Dorothy's health plummeted under the stress. They had gone from being respected business owners to being homeless, and the county seemed to think the story was over. They thought they had won. They thought Eddie Wise would just fade away into the statistics of black land loss. They were wrong. Eddie was a soldier, and a soldier knows how to dig in for a long campaign. The aftermath of the eviction was a period of profound darkness for the Wise family. Dorothy passed away shortly after they were forced from the farm. For Eddie, the loss was twofold. His land was gone, and the woman who had shared the dream of that land was gone with it. The grief was enough to break anyone, but for Eddie it became fuel. He began to reach out to activists, to legal experts, and to anyone who would listen to the reality of what had happened on that gravel driveway. The narrative the county tried to push was simple. He didn't pay his bills. But as the discovery process began in the ensuing legal battle, a much darker story began to emerge. It wasn't just about a missed payment. It was about a pattern of behavior within the local sheriff's department and the regional USDA offices. They found emails, they found testimonies, they found a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly to the deputy's doorstep. This wasn't a clerical error, it was a conspiracy of convenience, fueled by the very racism the Pigford case was supposed to have ended. As the case moved toward a climax, the focus shifted to the deputy's conduct. In a deposition, the cracks in the "just doing my job" defense began to widen. It became clear that the deputy had exceeded his authority. He hadn't just served a notice, he had acted with a level of personal animosity that violated Eddie's constitutional rights. The legal team, representing the interests of the displaced farmers, argued that the eviction was executed with unnecessary and excessive force and was motivated by racial bias. They pointed to the fact that white farmers in similar debt situations were given years of mediation, workout plans, and grace periods. Eddie, however, was given a 30-minute warning and a tactical squad. The disparity was impossible to ignore. The courtrooms of North Carolina are no strangers to tension, but the atmosphere during these hearings was electric. It was the weight of history pressing down on a single case. During the trial, the jury was forced to look at the photos of the eviction. They saw the sick woman on the lawn. They saw the decorated veteran being treated like a common criminal. And then, they heard the words of the deputy. They heard the testimony of those who had witnessed his behavior over the years. The defense tried to argue that the deputy was a hard-nosed lawman, but the evidence suggested he was a man who used his badge to settle a racial score. The turning point came when a former colleague of the deputy testified about the culture within the department. He spoke of a good old boy network, where black landowners were viewed as temporary caretakers of land that should be in other hands. This testimony shattered the county's defense. It was no longer a property dispute. It was a civil rights violation of the highest order. The jury didn't just see a farmer. They saw a man who had been robbed of his dignity by the very people he paid taxes to support. When the verdict finally came down, it sent a shockwave through the state. The $4.4 million figure wasn't just a random number. It was a calculated strike against the county's treasury, intended to be so painful that such an event could never be allowed to happen again. The jury found that the county and its agents had acted with malice and reckless indifference to Eddie Wise's rights. But as the news cameras swirled around the courthouse, Eddie didn't look like a man who had just won the lottery. He looked like a man who had finally been heard, but at a cost that no amount of money could ever repay. $4.4 million could buy a new farm. It could buy the best livestock in the country. But it couldn't bring back Dorothy. It couldn't erase the memory of his belongings being tossed into the mud. It couldn't give him back the 10 years of his life he spent fighting a ghost. The case of the racist deputy became a landmark. It is now cited in legal circles as a warning to local law enforcement agencies about the execution of civil evictions. It forced a total reevaluation of how the sheriff's department handled property disputes, especially those involving marginalized communities. The deputy in question? His career was effectively over. The man who wanted to be the hero of the eviction became the face of a multi-million-dollar failure. But the story doesn't end with a check. It ends with a reflection on the state of the American farmer. Today, less than 2% of farmers in the US are black, compared to 14% a century ago. This wasn't a natural decline, it was a managed one. The $4.4 million case was a rare moment where the system was forced to pay for its own cruelty. It serves as a beacon for other families who are currently fighting the same battles in silence. Think about your own home for a second. Think about the sense of security you feel when you lock your door at night. Now, imagine that security is a thin veil, one that can be ripped away by a man with a badge and a grudge. Eddie Wise's story is a reminder that the law is only as good as the people who enforce it. When the law falls into the hands of those blinded by prejudice, it becomes the very thing it was designed to prevent, an instrument of tyranny. As we look at the legacy of this case, we have to ask ourselves, how many other Eddie Wises are out there? How many farmers lost their land because they didn't have the resources to fight for 10 years? How many families were broken because a local official decided they didn't belong? The $4.4 million was a victory, yes, but the real victory will be when a man can stand on his porch, watch a car come up his driveway, and not have to wonder if he's about to lose everything because of the color of his skin. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think about this verdict. Was $4.4 million enough to compensate for a lifetime of work and the loss of a spouse? Or is there no price tag for the kind of trauma the Wise family endured? We see these stories often, but rarely do they end with this level of accountability. It's a conversation we need to have, because as long as the land is contested, the story isn't over. But to understand why this case resonated so deeply, why a local eviction turned into a multi-million-dollar judgment, we have to look at the evidence that the jury saw, the smoking gun that turned a routine civil procedure into a display of systemic malice. During the discovery phase of the lawsuit, Eddie's legal team began to unearth the internal communications of the Nash County Sheriff's Office. What they found wasn't just professional oversight, it was a digital trail of dehumanization. There were emails and internal memos where the Wise family wasn't referred to as citizens or even the subjects. They were spoken of in derogatory terms, their long-standing presence on the land framed as an irritation that needed to be scraped away. The deputy at the center of the case had been vocal in his disdain, not just in private, but in the way he orchestrated the raid. Yes, it was a raid. You don't bring 14 vehicles and tactical gear to a 70-year-old man's house for a civil debt unless you are trying to send a message. The message was clear. You do not belong here, and we have the power to make sure you never come back. The prosecution argued that the deputy had essentially weaponized the eviction process. In North Carolina, as in most states, an eviction is supposed to be a transition of property, not an execution of a person's dignity. There are protocols for how livestock should be handled, how personal property should be protected, and how the residents should be treated. But on that February morning, those protocols were treated as suggestions. The jury heard how Eddie's hogs, animals he had spent decades breeding for specific traits, were treated with zero regard for their welfare or their value as assets. This was a direct blow to Eddie's livelihood. By disrupting the farm's operations so violently, the county didn't just move him off the land, they effectively destroyed the business that could have helped him pay off any remaining debts. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure, engineered by those who held the keys to the county's power. It was the definition of a bad faith actor working under the color of law. As the trial moved into its second week, the defense attempted a strategy of procedural necessity. They argued that the presence of so many officers was a safety precaution, citing the potential for sovereign citizen behavior, a common tactic used to justify the militarization of police actions against black landowners. But when pressed for evidence that Eddie Wise had ever been violent or had ever threatened law enforcement, the defense had nothing. In fact, the records showed the opposite. Eddie Wise was a man of the cloth and a man of the uniform. He was a veteran who respected the flag and the law. The only threat he posed was his refusal to stop filing paperwork to prove his right to the land. The jury watched as the deputy struggled on the stand to explain why he felt the need for such overwhelming force against an elderly couple. His answers were clipped, defensive, and increasingly revealed a man who felt he was above the very laws he was tasked with serving. This is where we have to step back and look at the broader landscape of the American South. The story of Eddie Wise isn't an isolated incident. It is a modern chapter in a long, painful book titled The Great Dispossession. At the start of the 20th century, black farmers owned nearly 15 million acres of land in the United States. By the time Eddie Wise was being hauled off his porch, that number had plummeted by nearly 90%. The tactics used against the Wises, predatory lending, the intentional slowing of federal aid, and the aggressive use of local law enforcement were the same tactics used for generations. It's called heirs property exploitation in some cases, and administrative foreclosure in others. But the result is always the same: the transfer of wealth and land out of black hands. When the deputy told Eddie he had 30 minutes to leave, he wasn't just speaking for Nash County, he was speaking for a century of policy designed to ensure that the dirt stayed in the right hands. Think about the psychological impact of that. To be told that your life's work, your legacy, and your very shelter can be dissolved in half an hour. During the trial, expert witnesses testified about the trauma Eddie and Dorothy endured. They described a phenomenon known as land loss trauma, where the physical displacement from ancestral or long-held property leads to a rapid decline in physical health. For Dorothy Wise, the eviction was a death sentence. The stress of the raid, the humiliation of seeing her bed in the rain, and the loss of her sanctuary broke her spirit. The jury was forced to reckon with the fact that this wasn't just a financial dispute. The actions of the deputy and the county had a body count. The $4.4 million wasn't just for the land. It was a price tag placed on the human life that was shortened by the sheer cruelty of the state's intervention. When Eddie took the stand, the courtroom went silent. He didn't yell. He didn't point fingers. He spoke with the quiet, rhythmic cadence of a man who had seen the world and understood its flaws. He talked about the hogs. He talked about the way the light hit the fields in the morning. He talked about Dorothy's favorite chair. He recounted the moment the deputy put his hand on his holster while telling him to move faster. "I've served in the military," Eddie told the court. "I know what a threat looks like, and that day, on my own land, I was being treated like an enemy of the state." That testimony was the final nail in the county's coffin. It wasn't just that the law had been broken, it was that the social contract had been shredded. The people in that jury box looked at Eddie and didn't see a delinquent debtor. They saw their own fathers, their own grandfathers. They saw a man who had earned his peace, only to have it stolen. The deliberations didn't take long. When a jury returns with a $4.4 million verdict in a rural county, they aren't just awarding damages, they are staging a revolt. The breakdown of the award was telling. A significant portion was for the violation of Eddie's constitutional rights, specifically the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The court found that the seizure of the Wise farm was executed in a way that was so unreasonable, so devoid of basic human decency, that it transcended a civil matter and became a constitutional crisis. The judge, in his final remarks, noted that the badge is a symbol of public trust, and when that trust is used to enact personal or racial bias, the penalty must be severe enough to serve as a deterrent. The message to Nash County was loud and clear. Your budget is now $4.4 million lighter because you allowed a bully to wear a star. But what happened to the deputy? In many of these cases, the individuals responsible hide behind qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that often protects government officials from being held personally liable for constitutional violations. However, the sheer egregious nature of this case made that shield difficult to maintain. While the county bore the brunt of the financial settlement, the deputy's reputation was irrevocably tarnished. He became a pariah, the man whose personal bias cost the taxpayers millions. But for Eddie, the victory felt hollow. Following the trial, he spoke to reporters outside the courthouse. He wasn't celebrating. He looked tired. He talked about how he would have traded every cent of that $4.4 million for one more morning on the porch with Dorothy, watching the hogs in the pasture. The money could fix his bank account, but it couldn't fix the hole in his life. He had become a symbol of justice, but at the cost of his peace. This brings us to a critical point in our story. Why does this matter to you, the viewer, sitting at home? It matters because the Eddie Wise case is a mirror. It reflects the reality that our legal system is only as fair as the people on the ground. If a deputy in a small county can decide whose property rights are valid and whose are not, then no one's property is truly safe. It's a reminder that we must remain vigilant about local elections, about who becomes sheriff, who becomes the county commissioner, and who sits on the boards that oversee agricultural loans. These positions might seem small compared to the presidency or Congress, but they are the positions that decide if you get 30 minutes to pack your life into a suitcase or 30 years to grow a legacy. The $4.4 million was a win for Eddie, but it was a loss for the community that allowed such a culture to fester in the first place. In the years following the verdict, Eddie Milton Wise continued to advocate for black farmers. He didn't just take his money and disappear. He used his platform to highlight the ongoing struggles of those who are still trapped in the Pigford settlement limbo. He spoke at conferences, he met with lawmakers, and he became a mentor to younger farmers who were facing similar pressures. He often said that the land has a memory. The soil in Nash County remembers the sweat of his brow, but it also remembers the boots of the men who tried to take it. By winning his case, Eddie ensured that the memory of what happened that morning would be preserved in the public record, not as a legal eviction, but as a documented injustice. He made sure that the next time a deputy thinks about using their power to intimidate a landowner, they'll see the ghost of that $4.4 million check. As we wrap up this journey, take a moment to consider the resilience of the human spirit. Eddie Wise was a man who had everything taken from him: his wife, his career, his home, and his dignity. Most people would have stayed in that motel room and let the bitterness consume them. But Eddie chose to fight. He chose to believe that the system, as broken as it was, could still be forced to look at itself in the mirror. His story is a testament to the fact that justice isn't something that is given. It is something that is taken. It is carved out of a courtroom through months of testimony and years of heartache. It is the result of a refusal to be silenced. The $4.4 million is a number, but the real value of the case is the precedent it set, that in America, the size of your farm and the color of your skin should never dictate the level of your protection under the law. Thank you for spending this time with us. The story of Eddie Milton Wise is a difficult one, but it's one that needs to be told. It's a story about the land, the law, and the long road to accountability. If you found this story moving, please share it. The more people know about the struggles of farmers like Eddie, the harder it becomes for these injustices to happen in the shadows. Don't forget to like this video and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Have you heard of other cases where the system was held accountable for this kind of behavior? Let's keep the conversation going. We have a lot more stories to tell. Stories of history, of crime, and of the incredible people who refuse to back down. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember, the soil may be silent, but it always tells the truth.